Hey everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcouch. We're back for another edition of the Thyroid Answers Podcast. And today we've got another guest on. Today we are discussing gluten. And we're talking about bread. And we're discussing how you might be able to eat gluten again if you're a person who's gluten intolerant or gluten reactive. So we're going to talk with Nathan Hessing. He is the owner of Time Travelers Bakery. And he's going to talk to us about why or how bread, especially wheat-based bread, might be safe to eat again. Nathan, thanks for coming on the Thyroid Answers Podcast. How are you doing today?
I am doing so good. And thank you so much for having me. I'm always grateful when I can talk to more people about this because it's honestly blessed my life so much. So thank you so much for having me on here.
No problem. So we have gluten intolerance in my household. If you could provide an opportunity for my wife to have a real soft, squishy bread that doesn't fall apart when you make a sandwich or cut your gums because the crust is so freaking hard. And it actually tastes like bread like we used to. I think she might divorce me and go for you. All right. So let's do this. Let's start off with who the heck is Nathan Hessing and why are we talking to him? So give the listeners, if you don't mind, some background as to who you are and how you got to be the owner of Time Travelers Bakery.
Right. Okay. So I'm Nathan Hessing, as we were saying previously, and I got to be the owner of Time Travelers Bakery because of a huge life experience I had. So I actually do have an autoimmune disorder. I have fibromyalgia. And for me, this meant that I had 5 years of full body pain. I had chronic fatigue for literally over 15 years. But you can always write off chronic fatigue as, oh, you're a teenager, you're tired. Oh, you're in your 20s, you're in college, you're tired. There's so many ways that we can write it off until it just becomes to a point where it's like, this is not normal. So again, I had this full body pain for 5 years. I had chronic fatigue for 15 years. I had it then begin to mount into anxiety and depression because of chemical imbalances, as I know that you have addressed in your podcast with you focusing on hormone issues. And of course, I was having some minor gut issues, some minor skin issues. In short, I was experiencing problems all over my body by the time that this all climaxed. And I got to the point where I was like, I don't know that I'm going to be able to enter the workforce. At the climax of my chronic pain, I thought, by the time I'm 30, I might very well be in a wheelchair or using some assistance of that sort. It was just getting really, really bad. And then we figured out that there was 2 keys to what was going on in my body. After going to so many different doctors, after going to so many physical therapists, after doing so many different things, we figured out that there really was just 2 keys and that this was an autoimmune issue. We figured out that those 2 keys were, 1, my mental health, because when your mental health is on overdrive, so is your immune system. Your brain and your body are connected, and the more we deny that, the more we're going to notice some issues. So that was a huge key factor, and that is very important for anyone experiencing autoimmune issues, because again, when your brain is on overdrive, so is your immune system. It's in fight or flight response. And the second thing, and you can't even say that it was more or less important, but massively important thing, was the foods that I was eating. So I have always been a very, very healthy eater and very healthy person in general, if we're going to talk about exercise and things. But nonetheless, the foods that I was eating were really destroying my body. I had to cut out a ton of things, not just gluten and dairy and, sugar, like we talk about a lot, but I had to cut out tons of things, rice, beans, tons of different vegetables, a lot of different staple foods. And the list could go on and on and on here, but I'm just trying to illustrate to you that it was a ton of different foods. When I cut these foods out, my symptoms went away. But the thing is you cannot replace real nutrients from real food with supplements very effectively. I was experiencing nutrient deficiencies. And that's what got us started on the journey of opening the bakery and figuring out how people truly can eat wheat again. And we figured out, again, this time-honored, this ancient method of making breads that really is the ancient way of making breads that was made before people started experiencing massive amounts of gluten issues. And so in short, we go back in time using fermentation to make our breads. And these breads, with the fermentation, it eats through the gluten structure as well as a lot of the carbohydrate structure. So most people can have gluten back, including myself, who experienced 5 years of full body pain. So that's a huge, huge explanation, but I wanted to give you guys a full overarching view that this was a real thing and is a real thing for many people.
So you're having chronic health issues, you're going through a kind of conventional allopathic model. I'm guessing you did first, not really getting much success. I'm guessing that if you did a bunch of dietary changes, maybe even went into a functional health model to some degree. Did you do functional medicine to some degree?
Yeah. So I actually ended up being able to connect with a rheumatologist, and that can often be really hard for people to get in with rheumatologists. And at this point, I had already started changing my diet to a large degree. And we were seeing a lot of changes. So he did offer some guidance through that, but I didn't see like a professional nutritionist or anyone like that during my process. No, I was guided by that rheumatologist, but didn't see someone of that sort.
Okay, so you were more of in an allopathic model, never really entered a functional medicine model, because in a functional medicine model, one of the things, if people have autoimmune conditions, one of those things we do is put people on an autoimmune protocol, autoimmune diet, where we remove like wheat, dairy, soy, we remove some of the yeast, we remove all the kind of the junk food, like really
all
clean
the
up
elimination.
The diet.
Yeah.
And so you're left typically with foods that are going to be less potentially problematic. So we get the lectins out, the nightshades out. And my guess is you did some of that stuff. At some point, did you do food intolerance testing, or did you just kind of do it via, this doesn't make me feel good, I got to remove this? Or did you do some food intolerance testing and then realized, hey, these are foods, maybe even healthy foods that I'm eating that I'm intolerant to?
Right. And so what I did from intolerance testing basis was not something like, your Everlywell test or things like that we hear of. What we did was an elimination diet that you were describing previously. So we did an elimination diet of all of those types of things that could be common possible offenders. And then we added them back in to see if they caused offense when they were added back in. So kind of a boots on the ground approach to that testing rather than just a chemical one. Both are very valid. We just did the boots on the ground one, and that worked well for me.
Okay. And so as part of that boots on the ground testing process, you identified that wheat was an issue?
Yes.
Okay.
Definitely. That was the core key issue. And everything else was not a good thing as well. But wheat was this core thing. It was really hard for me.
Okay. So then you gave up wheat. And for people who are listening, there are ways. Like, listen, Nathan did it the way a lot of times I try and get people to do it, is do it, start with like an autoimmune paleo type protocol, which kind of cleans up all this stuff. And then we'll do some work on their GI tract to kind of calm the immune inflammatory process down, try and support a healthier gut barrier, and then try and reintroduce foods. And sometimes it works out really well. And for sometimes people are like, something's bugging me, but I can't figure it out. And so before we kind of get too far down this whole story with the wheat, there's a couple of key points that I want to point out here for people. One is, when you have kind of chronic inflammation and irritation in your GI tract, you can start to develop what we call a leaky gut barrier. And the cells of the GI tract are attached to each other. There's these little bridges that connect them. And when we have poor digestion, low stomach acid, low digestive enzymes, poor bile physiology, wearing away of the immune system of the GI tract, dysbiosis in the bowel, there's a high probability of developing this leaky gut scenario. And what can happen then is, undigested proteins. Well, let's do this. Foods have protein. All foods have some protein in them.
Yes.
Proteins break down into peptides, and then peptides break down into these things called amino acids. That's really what we want to cross the barrier. But if we have poor digestion and we have a leaky barrier, there's greater likelihood that undigested protein pieces, these things called peptides, can leak across the barrier. And when they leak across the barrier, the immune system is sitting on the other side of that intestinal barrier and saying, hey, this thing should not be here. And you might get away with it for a little bit of a period of time, but after a point of time, your immune system starts to say, hey, that thing should not be here like this. We're going to start to react to that when it crosses the barrier. And that's what we call loss of tolerance. So for, you could think of loss of tolerance like people in your life. Some people, they come into your life and they just light your heart up. Like your wife, my wife, right? You're like, oh, gosh, right? Then there's people in your life that you could give them or take them. They don't add a lot. They don't take a lot away. You tolerate them, right? And then there is people in your life that you just can't stand. When they get within your circle, it just brings your blood pressure up. You just cannot tolerate them. They've done something. They've wronged you in some way. You cannot tolerate them. When we're talking about loss of tolerance to foods, we're talking about the same thing. These foods have crossed the barrier too many times, poorly digested, and the immune system says enough already and starts to create an immune response. And so anytime you eat that food protein and it doesn't get broken down well, it gets in the system, it can start triggering an immune and inflammatory response.
Yes.
And the important part is you might not always have GI symptoms when that occurs. You could have extra intestinal symptoms. You could have neurologic symptoms, anxiety, depression. You could have skin issues. You could have rashes. You could have acne. You could have migraines. You could have almost any symptom can be triggered by this inflammatory immune-driven process that occurs in this GI tract. And so that's really important for the listener, because now we're going to get into a little bit more discussion and why I'm going to let you maybe kind of tie into a little bit about what makes wheat this demon thing that everybody says everybody's got to be gluten-free. And maybe we have to talk about wheat and gluten being a different thing. So if you feel comfortable,
yes,
let's talk about wheat, what it is, maybe the components of wheat, because gluten is just a component of it. And then we'll get into maybe why everybody thinks it's this demon. All right. So first, kind of talk about wheat and the components of wheat, including gluten a little bit.
Great. So yeah, wheat is not just gluten. Gluten is what we would probably, a good term for gluten is that it's a binder. So here's what I mean by that. When bread rises, it's almost like you're filling up a balloon, right? And it's just growing like that. So a balloon has a rubber-like structure. And if that balloon were not stretchy, you couldn't fill it up. Same with bread. Bread needs to have a rubber-like structure in it that also holds together all of those carbohydrates so that you can fill it up like a balloon and it can rise and be puffy, as well as not crumble apart like gluten-free breads often do. So gluten, again, is that binding rubbery element that allows it to have a balloon structure and fill up with not air, but carbon dioxide, rather, while it rises. So that's what the gluten is. And one note on gluten, as we talked about with that leaky gut syndrome, gluten is the reason why gluten is a big buzzword is because gluten, the proteins in it, are known for leaking through gut walls if you have a weak gut. So what people are often experiencing when they have gluten issues is that the gluten is leaking through their gut wall and they're having an immune reaction, which, as we said, can manifest in a multitude of different ways. It does not necessarily mean that you're going to have gut pain. For me, I didn't have a lot of gut issues until I actually had cut things out and added them in. Then my gut was like, no, we're not going to have this back. But during my huge journey, I didn't have a lot of those gut issues. I was experiencing the immune responses of headaches, chronic fatigue, of this multitude of problems throughout my whole body. So that's why we couldn't get down to the fact that it was the gut. So that's gluten. Gluten leaks through gut walls, but gluten also gives bread great structure so it can rise. Now, there's so much more to bread than just gluten. There's obviously the carbohydrates, which is what make us crave bread, because carbohydrates are historically the base of the human diet. And there's also, again, a lot of fiber in breads, which can be really hard to replace when we have to cut breads out of our life. A note on fiber is that fiber is not fermented through when we do ferment breads, so the fiber content doesn't lower. Carbohydrates, however, are fermented through when we ferment breads. And so the carbohydrate, the count does reduce somewhat, but along with that is the type of carbohydrates change. So people who experience issues with blood sugar spiking and things like that, when they eat fermented breads, their blood sugar often will not spike as much. And the reason for that is because, again, the carbohydrate type is changing. When we eat carbohydrates, what happens with our blood sugar? If you do it with your hand, it shows, boom, it spikes up and then it crashes. When we eat what's called a fast-acting carbohydrate, like table sugar. Now, if you eat something called a slow-acting carbohydrate or a low GI carbohydrate, what happens is the carbohydrates get released slowly into your bloodstream, and your blood sugar looks more a little bit like a curve or a slight plateau, which is a good place to be. So what I'm saying here is that fermentation not only breaks down the gluten structure so it's easier to digest, it's basically pre-digested in many ways, but it also changes the type of carbohydrates so they release slowly into your bloodstream and do not spike blood sugar as much. This is a great thing for people with autoimmune issues, people with diabetes, or just people that want to eat carbohydrates without feeling maybe a little bit tired afterwards, or without feeling like they're going to gain a lot of weight from eating moderate amounts of carbohydrates.
So let me back you up a little bit, because I want to get into that part, but we're not ready for that. So
okay, yeah.
If we're talking about, some people think that wheat, right, is that they're either, people are, what typically gets measured when somebody's told they're gluten, let me do it this way. There's a difference between, you can be gluten intolerant, which is a reactivity to typically the gluten or gliadin component of wheat. Okay.
Right.
There's also something called celiac disease. Now, celiac disease is the disease that's often associated with gluten intolerance if you have the right kind of genetic makeup to develop that disorder.
Yes.
Some people get tested for gluten or celiac disease. They get a celiac panel done, and they get tested for a component of wheat called the 33-mer component of gliadin. And that's, if that's positive, then they're told that they're gluten intolerant, they have celiac disease if the rest of the panel is positive. But you could be, there are other components of wheat, and I think this is important for people to point out.
Yes.
So when we're talking about, one of the reasons that when somebody does test positive for gluten, gliadin 33-mer, or one of the other components of it, we tell them to be, hey, you shouldn't be eating the wheat products. I think another issue occurs, though, is somebody gets a traditional allopathic test done for gluten sensitivity. They get a celiac panel test done. They're not really getting a test done that's giving the full complement of these peptides that are in wheat that they could be reactive to. So there's a whole bunch of components in wheat that you could react to. Gluten is one component. The 33-mer component that's typically tested on a celiac panel is only one component. So there's lots of wheat germ agglutinin, you got gluteomorphins, you got different types of gliadins, that 17-mer, 33-mer, 21-mer. You have all kinds of these different peptides. So if you really want to know if you're reactive to wheat and what component, there are tests. Cyrex Labs is a great test that has all the potential components of wheat that you might react to, and that might help you understand. I have gluten intolerance. I have wheat egg intolerance to a
Correct.
component of wheat. It may not be gluten. It could be another component of wheat. And that becomes important in the discussion we're going to have with Nathan, because we need to understand this fermentation process that makes what he does a little bit different. And what component of wheat is really being, are we breaking down the whole component of wheat, or are we just changing this gluten component of wheat? That's going to be an important conversation, because we do, listen, I would love to have a regular piece of regular bread again. And if I can do it, that would be awesome, because I love bread. But just because if it's gluten-free, but you react to a different component of wheat, we have to find out if that's still safe for you. So
correct.
Let's talk about that first, and then I'll dig in a little bit more. When we're talking about your bread, we're talking about a type of sourdough bread, which historically people have said, hey, sourdough bread is gluten-free. I don't know if that's necessarily always the case. You're going to probably tell me it's not.
Yeah, that's not the case.
When we do sourdough bread, right, is it denaturing all of the potential reactive proteins, or is it really just the gluten component of it that's being kind of denatured and broken down? Do you know?
Great. I'm so yes, I do. I'm so glad that you got specific with this. We often don't dive this deep because often consumers don't have that ground level data that you just showed for us to even dive this deep with them. But yes, so the scientific data shows that fermentation is going to be breaking down gluten, as well as reducing the reactivity of the insulin spikes for carbohydrates, as I was explaining earlier. It does not outline the other things of wheat. So many people, and I guess I'll go out on a limb here and say it seems like most people who have wheat issues, it's something with gluten. Now, there are other parts of wheat that people can be reactive to. Just like I can be reactive to apples or bananas or whatever, there's other parts of wheat besides gluten that people can be reactive to. Often, this is referred to in layman's speech as a wheat allergy. So if I have a gluten issue, then double heavy fermented time traveler's bread will most likely work for me. Now, if I have a wheat allergy, which is going to be a intolerance to one of these other factors in wheat that we were outlining earlier, which again, thank you so much for outlining those, then the likelihood of double heavy fermented time traveler's bread working for you is much lower, because there's not scientific data that shows it works for those other elements. Those are just not as common, so that data isn't there. But for gluten issues and for carbohydrate related blood sugar spikes, yes, the data is there for that. So I'm so glad you cleared that up. That's awesome.
So the fermentation process helps break down this gliadin peptide, right? So in theory, it might also break down some of the other peptide portions of it.
Correct.
So in theory, it could, but that's one of the things we have to just kind of have that. So everybody doesn't rush out, go order Nathan's bread and then say, hey, I think I had a reaction to it, because there are components like the gluteomorphin component of it that can create a lot of neurologic issues that somebody could still potentially have some response to. But we would think, we would think that if this type of cooking could break down, metabolize, denature the peptide sequences of gluten and gliadin, it might do the same thing to glutenin and some of the other components of wheat as well. Possibly.
Correct. Yes. Right. The scientific data isn't there for us to promise, and we never want to promise anything that isn't scientifically proven. But if we want to go with the data trend that we're seeing and say, well, it looks like it's trending in this direction, that is a very fair assumption and a very fair test for someone to take that feels that they're in a pretty safe place in their health journey. Now, for someone who just has random reactivity to wheat in all different directions, and it could be gluten, it could just be all these different things, maybe you could do a test, but do so with your thinking cap on, as we all say with our health journeys. Don't just let other people rule things, because it's much more complicated than just I'm experiencing chronic headaches, as we talked about with this brain gut barrier kind of thing. Like a leaky gut can affect so many different things in so many different ways.
And so I think if you're, for the listener, if you're considering something like this and you want to see definitively how am I responding, Cyrex is, I think it's their Array 2, would be a great test to take after you started consuming the bread. And now you can say, am I reacting to any component of wheat here? And if you're not, then it's probably a good thing. But and we will probably talk about maybe why conventional wheat as we know it here in the US, maybe there's a bigger thing. Maybe it's not always the wheat itself or the grain itself, but maybe some other factors.
It's often chemicals applied in many other things.
So we'll dive in. We'll dive into that. But so tell us about bread. Like, tell me about bread. Like I don't know anything, and I pretty much don't know anything. So let's talk about bread. Typically somebody goes to the store and they're buying a loaf of bread. That would they're buying conventionally at the store. It's not sourdough. It's not fermented, right? They're just, tell us what's different between traditional bread you buy on the shelf, sourdough bread, gluten-free options maybe, and Nathan's Time Travelers.
Great.
Bread.
Okay. So let's go ahead and start with just the classic Wonder Bread that you buy at the store that you know is going to hurt you. So that classic Wonder Bread, there's a lot of things that could potentially hurt you if you're, genetically prone or stressed and have a weak gut, or other factors. So those things include that the wheat that is used in that Wonder Bread has likely been exposed to things such as bromates and glyphosates. I will explain what both of those things are. Glyphosates are just another word for weed killers. Roundup, for example, is a brand of glyphosates, just as Kleenex is a brand of, facial tissue. So again, glyphosates are weed killers. Now, the thing about glyphosates is in America and across different places throughout the world, often glyphosates are applied directly to the wheat supply right before it is harvested and sent off to market for grinding and human consumption. I'm not saying the soil around the wheat. I'm saying the wheat berries themselves are applied with glyphosate, with weed killer, right before it's harvested. That's pretty crazy. The reason why is because for a farmer, from a business perspective, the harvest of wheat, what has to happen in the last phase of that wheat's maturation right before you harvest it is the sun has to beat down on it and dry it out so that it's almost dead to a sense. It's just dried enough that you can harvest it and then you can grind it and, make flour or whatever it is that you want to do. So if we don't want to wait for the sun to beat down on it and dry it out in an unpredictable manner, because that's how Mother Nature is, then all you got to do is spray some weed killer on it, and within 48 hours it is dried, dead, ready to grind up. So good for business, bad for humans. That is completely legal by the law of America. It's completely okay for us to do that. So if it's good for business and the weathering season, then we will do it.
So let me jump in there with that, because I think that's a really important point for the listener. He's with Nathan's kind of saying they're spraying this on, and that's exactly, you'll hear about Roundup Ready crops. Those are ones you can spray glyphosate on, and it's not going to kill them because they've been modified so that you can kill all the stuff around it, but the plant survives. Then there's things like wheat that they spray this glyphosate on. essentially exactly what Nathan said, is to kind of make it easier to harvest, to kind of essentially kill it. So that way it's easier to harvest. Now, you would think, well, why would we want it? If they're just sprayed it, why would that be good for us? What we've been told is that glyphosate is essentially an antibiotic. It kills organisms. And because it kills organisms and it works through a pathway, it's called the Shikimate pathway. We spray this stuff on, it disrupts the Shikimate pathway. Humans don't have a Shikimate pathway. Therefore, glyphosate is safe for humans. We can spray it on there. You can consume it. No big deal. The problem is, that's the big issue here. Is that now you have this glyphosate that's on your food, fresh, it hasn't been that long since it's been sprayed, and now you're consuming glyphosate, which truly directly won't harm you directly because you don't have the Shikimate pathway, but you have trillions of organisms, bacteria in your gut that does have a Shikimate pathway. And by disrupting the gut biome, you change everything about your physiology. Okay. So that's why it's so important. But from a manufacturer's standpoint, it's safe for humans because we don't have the pathway. We left out that little piece that's important, but it disrupts the gut biome. And people would thought, well, the gut biome's not part of the human, so it's not a big deal. And in reality, it's a huge part of our physiology. So I'm glad you brought that part up. I just wanted to touch on that, but talk about bromates now.
Right. Okay. So bromates, they have been identified as potentially carcinogenic substances by the FDA. And they are illegal for use in many countries. In fact, if your flour is bromated in a lot of Asian countries, in a lot of European countries, then your business is closed, like bar none kind of thing. It's illegal. Now, what are bromates? Why would we even apply them to our wheat if they can potentially cause cancer? Bromates, what they do, earlier I described that gluten is like a balloon and it fills up with air, or rather carbon dioxide, during the rising process of bread. And so what bromates are is they help that balloon's structure be more stretchy as well as like stick together better. So it helps the structure of the bread and that it can rise better. That's a wonderful thing for bread to rise better. I like that idea, but not if there's the side note of potentially carcinogenic in my food. Now, the thing about bromates is they are shown that they do cook off in the high temperature that we use in basic baking, but still, I do not think that it's worth the risk to be putting bromates in our products when they honestly can rise very sufficiently with the gluten, the high level of gluten that is in modern wheat. So we do not need those bromates, and we do protect against them. And we, again, also protect against those glyphosates and troublers. Okay, so
that's
go for it.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, we just barely kind of dove into what is the problem with a Wonder Bread, and that was the chemical issue. Now, let's talk about the gluten issue with Wonder Bread. So for this Wonder Bread that you're going to eat and it'll taste yummy, but you know that you're going to have a reaction, not only is there potential for those chemicals to be in there, but also the gluten structure is very, very intact. So all through time, from Egyptian times, and honestly, probably before Egyptian times and onward, humans did not use lab-produced yeast. Instead, we used fermentation. We used a natural yeast to rise our breads. This natural fermentation not only rises breads, but it also breaks down gluten structure, pre-digest carbohydrates, as I had addressed earlier, which allows it, again, to be pre-digested in a layman's term before it hits your stomach. So this Wonder Bread that you're eating, not only does it have those chemicals applied potentially, depending on where the wheat crop was from, but also the gluten structure, you have to do all the work. Your stomach has to do all of it. I do not believe that everyone on planet Earth has a gluten intolerance. I do, however, believe that gluten is a hard thing to digest, whether you have an intolerance or not. And that fermentation is supposed to be applied to gluten-based products. It's been that way for thousands of years. And it's only since the 1920s, 1940s, did we start graduating out of this fermentation-based baking into yeast baking, which does not break down that gluten structure for you. So that's how the Wonder Bread would be hard. And then you asked about a couple of other different types of breads and what they would be like. I can dive into those as well if you'd like me to. Whatever.
Yeah, just a little bit. Because somebody's going to be told, hey, you got to be gluten-free. So they're going to go to the next thing they may go to is a gluten-free bread.
A gluten-free loaf. And how would that be good? How would that be bad? Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the gluten-free loaf. Gluten-free loaf, better option than Wonder Bread in many ways, because, we're eliminating the gluten. And the likelihood of us having those chemicals, it's very likelihood that they will not be there. Very, very likely. Now, are we protecting against high levels of blood sugar spikes if we are eating gluten-free products? The answer is definitely no. In fact, if you were to eat a gluten-free product for breads versus a Wonder Bread, the likelihood of you eating, of having a very high blood sugar spike with that gluten-free product, that's there, because with gluten-free products, often lots of sugars and other things are added to make them taste palatable. But along with there being lots of sugars added, usually, not all the time, but often that is the case, there are also things called binders added. So when I am making a normal loaf of bread with gluten in it, that gluten, again, binds the bread together so it can stick together and it can rise and have that rubbery effect like a balloon. Now, if I don't have the gluten, if I don't add something to bind it and stick it together, then it essentially is like a bowl of cream of wheat. There's just nothing to hold all those grains together. Right. So I have to add external binders. There's binders that aren't usually offensive to people, like eggs, if they don't have an egg allergy, that can bind grains together. But then there's a lot of other things like xanthan gums and tons of other things, which are probably not going to be big issues. But when we start stacking a ton of different types of binders together that have very long names, as we know as consumers, we get to be in a little bit of a gray zone. And so if someone's eating gluten-free products and still experiencing some reactivity, and they're like, but I cut out wheat, it can be that there's a lot of stuff that has to be added to those gluten-free breads in order to make them function somewhat effectively, like sugars and binders. Now, go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, yes. Let me jump in there. So I think this is important for people too. So Nathan's not looking at some of this, he's doing the cooking side of it, right? And I'm looking at the immune side of it. Yes. But what can happen is a lot of these, he did cover some of the key points there, but some of the foods that we move to that are gluten-free just because gluten-free doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy, right? And so
correct.
More carbohydrates, more sugars, more additives to make them taste or function somewhat like the bread we're kind of used to. And all of the grain structures, some of these alternative grains that might be used to make the bread. We were talking before about proteins, peptides, and amino acids. Well, they may have similar protein or peptide structures. So there's this concept.
Great point.
Right, of cross-reactivity, where if the amino acid structure looks similar enough to the gluten, my immune system, which may not be optimally healthy, might distinguish or say that undigested peptide that still crossed my barrier looks very similar to the peptide I was reacting to before, so that's gluten. I'm going to create my antibodies to gluten are going to react against those other peptide structures. Yeah. So for the listener, like, what does cross-reactivity mean? Kind of think about if you dated an identical twin, okay? So let's say you dated an identical twin and you decide to go out to the bar. It's a dark environment. You had way too many cocktails. And now your partner and their identical twin, who, by the way, decided to dress identically that night, go into the bathroom.
Just for fun.
One of them comes back out and you kiss the wrong one. Is it really your fault? You're in a dark environment. You've had too much alcohol. You're not thinking clearly. You miss the key things. When you have an immune or autoimmune issues going on and your immune system is dysregulated, sometimes it's doing the best it can. And proteins that maybe you never would have reacted to before, or these peptides you wouldn't have reacted before, if they look similar enough, they're going to respond. Just like I had too many cocktails. I thought it was the twin I was dating, but it wasn't. So the problem becomes, A, there's things in the food, in these alternatives that maybe not as healthy. And two, you could still have reactivity to them, what we call cross reactivity or just reactivity to those peptides, because you still have that leaky gut barrier.
Yes.
So, go ahead.
To go even further with what you're saying here, not only can there be cross reactivity where it's like a twin, it's similar but different, there can also be, it wouldn't be cross reactivity necessarily. There can also be situations where the exact same things that you're having issues with in the gluten-filled bread can be in the gluten-free bread. So here's what I mean by that. One example of this would be phytates. So let me just explain what that is. Most very shelf-stable things that Mother Nature produces, such as nuts or grains, they have nature's preservative in it, which is phytates. So imagine having to break down a preservative that Mother Nature herself built into a food product. That's pretty hard for us to break down. So fermentation also breaks down phytates so that we don't have to do all that work in our gut, just like it breaks down the gluten structure for us. I don't think that everyone in the world needs to avoid phytates. I do think that everyone needs to be aware that fermentation is something that we've used for thousands of years, and it breaks a lot of things down that our stomachs would otherwise have a hard time with. So these phytates, again, they're in nuts, they're in pretty much every grain that you access. So if you're having an issue with phytates that you don't know about, as well as a gluten issue, because those often coexist with each other, this gluten-free bread might be easier for you to digest, but you might still have some fatigue after eating it. You might still feel heavy because those phytates are not broken down, and they're in pretty much every grain and every nut. Nut flours, rice flours, those are grains, those are nuts.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, good point there. And we'll take it one step further. There are components, and he was talking about the binders, and you could be reactive to some of those binding agents,
correct,
right?
Correct.
And you think it's the wheat, but you may be intolerant to a different component. So that part's good. So we've talked about traditional white bread. We've talked, and we could put all the kind of traditional bread processes there. Yeah. We talked about the gluten-free alternatives. Let's go to maybe the conventional sourdough bread, and then we'll get to yours. So talk about conventional sourdough bread, how it's done, what makes it different from what's traditionally done with regular loaf bread, and why that still might not be safe for somebody who's got gluten issues, even though sometimes we're told that, hey, sourdough bread's going to be fine.
Right. Okay. So first caveat I want to give, because this is a paradigm shifter, I think, for a lot of people. Most people who think they have had sourdough have never had real sourdough. If you go to the grocery store and buy something that's labeled as sourdough bread, the chances of it being 100% authentic are very low. So 100% authentic sourdough-based products do not contain any yeast whatsoever other than the starter, that fermented base. Starters should also not contain any yeast. Starters should just be flour and water, or some carbohydrate base and water fermented with that fermentation process has introduced a culture of bacteria into it that's similar to what we have in our gut biome, that it's a probiotic base that can break down all these things like I've discussed. Most sourdough breads that people buy in the store have this sourdough culture in them, but they are heavily assisted via a man-made yeast. So that full breakdown process that we are talking about of carbohydrates, of gluten, of all that stuff, it's kind of weakened, and you can't really get that full breakdown because the yeast takes over from that fermentation process, because the yeast works way faster than fermentation does, than traditional fermentation.
So let's jump into that a little bit more. So
yeah.
The difference between the yeast that we might see in a commercial sourdough,
the regular the regular yeast.
Regular yeast, that's not what would be used. It's not what you're using. You're using.
It is not.
Okay.
No.
And so the problem is that yeast might, correct me because I'll probably get this wrong, but that yeast is going to create this impact on the bread, do what we want it to do, but it's not going to actually break down these peptides and proteins like maybe a slower fermentation process would be. Is that
correct?
Close?
Yes. So this is a thing that will be a little bit more approachable for a lot of us to understand. When we have a classic sourdough only has 3 ingredients: flour, water, and salt. Nothing else. It has the starter, which is just fermented flour and water. So the only ingredients are flour, water, and salt. Imagine making a baked good that literally only has flour, water, and salt in it. It's going to taste gross. Like it just won't taste good. True, authentic, classic sourdough just made with flour, water, and salt is delicious. It actually has a slightly cheesy, flavor to it, that tang, that sour, cheesy tang. The reason why it has all this flavor is because the sourdough starter, as it ferments, as it breaks down all of these things, it's doing it via an acid-driven reaction. And that acid is what adds all this flavor and all of those things. Now, a normal yeast, if we just got flour, water, and salt and then applied yeast, the bread would rise, but it wouldn't taste good because there's no acid-driven reaction. That acid is what's breaking down all of these things in the breads. It's pre-digesting it for us. But the normal yeast doesn't have that acid-driven reaction.
So let's classify what's normal yeast and what's. So when you say normal yeast, right? That's man-made, conventional yeast.
The yeast packets that we.
The yeast packets. That's man-made yeast. Mm-hmm. That's different than. How do you classify the natural?
The sourdough starter. Yeah. So the natural
sourdough starter. So how do we differentiate those two things for somebody?
Yes.
They're like, I need yeast. No, you need sourdough starter. Like how does somebody, what are they looking for that's going to be different? Are they still getting yeast? Does it go by a different name? Or
yes. So if someone has a yeast issue, which a lot of people do, they can't consume yeasted products. They can often, from everything that we have seen, we have never encountered anyone that has a yeast issue that cannot have our products. So there is technically yeast in it, but it's not the man-made yeast that most people are having reactivity to. So let me go a little bit deeper since we're having questions on that. Now, if I were to create a sourdough starter, this is how it goes. I get flour or some type of carbohydrate and water. I mix them together. And then I leave those either uncovered or slightly uncovered in an open area. And the reason why I do that is because all around us, everywhere, at this very moment, there are what are called lactobacilli floating in the air all around us. These lactobacilli are probiotics, basically. And they survive on consuming carbohydrates. And when they can consume carbohydrates, they can also reproduce and produce colonies of lactobacilli. If you ever buy a probiotic, the chances of it having multiple strains of lactobacilli are basically 100%. Like that is what we use as probiotics, basically. So to reiterate, to make a sourdough starter, we mix together a carbohydrate and water. We let it sit out. And then all of these lactobacilli latch onto those carbohydrates and start consuming them, and then producing a colony of themselves during that consuming process. And so what we do is we continually feed it with a little bit more carbohydrates and then some water so it doesn't dry out. And they continue to produce a stronger and stronger colony. So this starter has a colony of those probiotics that are floating all around us that's like really well built up inside of it. These probiotics, as they eat through carbohydrates, produce this acid and this carbon dioxide that would make the bread rise, but the acid would break down all of those things like we've discussed. So that's how a starter would work, is it's driven by a literal probiotic that breaks things down with an acid-driven reaction.
So that's
yeast is not that way.
So the natural starter, you're not calling that a yeast, you're just calling that a natural starter?
Yeah, so technically lactobacilli is a type of yeast, but that's a hard thing. That's a hard thing to say because people who have yeast issues do not have issues with this lactobacilli-driven fermentation. Even though lactobacilli is a type of natural yeast.
I would think natural bacteria, right?
Yeah.
So I think the issue here is, I just want to make sure. So what's man-made, no bacteria, right?
Mm-hmm.
What you're giving is a live, living starter, but you call it a starter. I'm just, for a person who's going, hey, do I need yeast to make my sourdough bread? It's not technically a yeast. We're just calling it, the technical term is just, this is a sourdough starter.
Yes.
That's a technical term.
Correct.
In conventional bread baking, they're using yeast, which is a totally different thing than we're using with our sourdough starter, right?
Yep. And yeast is technically a live and active culture,
right?
But it acts very different than this lactobacilli that we use in sourdough starter.
Yeah,
yeast is still live, it's still active, but it's not going to do the breakdown that we're discussing that we want, so our bodies don't have to do all that work.
All right, fantastic.
Yeah,
got it. All right, so sourdough bread, the difference between in conventional sourdough bread, using this yeast starter doesn't get the acid. It's not, you don't have all this bacteria in there that you would in the natural starter, bread starter that we're talking about with what you use. So where does like in the decades ago, they just made it, right? Where does somebody get a natural starter today? Right? Because if they're going to the grocery store, they go on they get a box of, I don't know, Fleischmann's or something it's called. Is it that the little packets of stuff?
Rapid rise yeast. Yep.
Right. So that's a different thing. Where do they get this starter, right?
So you can technically make them yourselves, just like all the pioneers did, just like the Egyptians did. I personally don't like doing that. I think that there are blessings of living in the internet era and that you can just order them from people. We sell them. You can buy starters on different sites like Etsy and things like that. You can also make them yourself if that's something that you want to play around with. The starter that we have, we actually didn't make it ourselves because we wanted to make sure that we were starting with something that was well established. So like our starter is about 17 years old. It has a really good probiotic base that really works really well. And so again, you can make it yourself via that process that I kind of described. You can purchase it from someone that has had it going for a while. Whatever you want is great. And if it's been going 100 years or if it's been going like 2 or 3 years, that difference doesn't matter immensely. It matters that it's been going for a while, but sometimes people are like, oh, if it's been going 150 years, that means it's going to have better breakdown capabilities. That's not the case. But you do want one that's maybe a little bit established. That'll be good for you. And one note I wanted to add, a lot of people will say, well, I don't like sourdough. I don't like things that are fermented. They don't taste good. Again, these grocery store products that you are consuming that sourdough flavor does not come from actual fermentation in the way that you think it is. The sourdough flavor that most of these products come from is vinegar and other things that they add into it because they're not actually fermenting it deep enough to provide that flavor. So you're tasting vinegar. That's a semi-abrasive flavor. So a lot of people don't like sourdough that would like it if they had real sourdough.
Yeah. So if I think about this, I think the big difference here, as I take a look at it, if you're using like a baker's yeast, which is a yeast, right? Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that's a yeast. When you're talking about what you're using, you're talking about lactobacillus, which is a bacteria. So we have two different organisms that are being used. They're probably producing, as you said, one's producing an acid that's creating all this other natural flavoring and stuff to it. The other is a yeast that's doing the fermentation process, and it's producing different metabolites, different byproducts, which is going to potentially provide a different flavor or no flavor. And then it's got to be compensated with some type of additive to try and create the process. So this is
correct.
I just wanted to kind of, because I think, and the reason I was really hitting on that is I really wanted that. I want people to understand there's a difference between what this starter is. It seems to me that one's an actual yeast, one's an actual bacteria, two different types of things. And so why did we use one versus the other? Well, maybe the yeast is easier and cheaper to make. And that's just that's typically the way why we do things, right? We want to make it simple and cost effective.
Yeah. The product, if we are using a man-made yeast, the product from start to finish, you can have it done in often as little as 3 hours. Now, the product that I make it the day before, and then it ferments overnight into the next day. And it takes a lot longer to make because I have to give that fermentation time to do its breakdown work and for the bread to rise. So yeah, it's more cost effective to do classic, Wonder or Bimbo bread. But we all know that are dealing with these issues that sometimes quick has a lot of side effects. So we've covered Wonder bread, we've covered gluten-free bread, we've covered a sourdough you buy from the grocery store. Now to just kind of hit the last little bit, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
If I buy a real, authentic sourdough loaf, that's wonderful. And all of the studies that you find online, they are based on real, authentic sourdough breads. Wonderful options. Here's the thing with that. These real, authentic sourdough breads are not made specifically with gluten-intolerant individuals in mind. So these breads are fermented authentically, yes, but are they fermented deeply? Usually, no. Even if a bread says, oh yeah, we ferment it for 24 hours. Usually what that means is that for about half of that fermentation time, if not more, that bread is in a fridge fermenting. Fermentation it's not molding, it's not, but the process has some similarities in how it goes. So we all know that if you put something in a fridge, it doesn't mold very quickly. But if you leave it on the countertop, it molds a lot quicker, right? So these people that are doing a 24-hour ferment and they're putting it in the fridge for most of it, it's not really fermenting for what you'd think it would in 24 hours because it's in a cold environment. That process slows down a ton. That's one thing that happens a lot with classic real sourdoughs. Now, another thing that almost always guaranteed happens is when they're fermenting, not only will they often not ferment very deeply with gluten intolerant individuals in mind, but what we do when we're baking in most countries is we have our baked good, right? Our bread, we have our work surface and we cover that work surface with flour. We powder it with flour and then so that our product doesn't stick to the work surface. That flour that we're powdering the work surface with never got fermented through. And you powder your work surface and shake your loaf about 3 hours before it goes in the oven. So it only has contact with that lactobacilli for 3 hours and it's not heavily mixed into it. So that's never really going to get fermented through. Plus, the whole fermentation of the product may have not been as deep as something else. Now, graduating from that real authentic sourdough, which is a great option for many people, to ours, what we did is we took that real authentic sourdough has been proven to work for many people with gluten issues. And then we took it to another level. We said, we are going to ferment twice as long in a warm environment so that it actually really ferments deeply. We are going to use extra starter or extra probiotics so that it ferments deeply. We are never going to apply flour after the first mix so that everything gets fermented through and has a full opportunity to ferment. And then also we're going to test our products on people that have gluten issues, autoimmune issues, to see if they're experiencing reactivity and things like that. So we took the classic sourdough that has been scientifically proven to work for many people, but still has these faults. And we took it deeper is what we did, because people aren't doing this. People aren't providing this for what people need.
So what are you doing to flour your workstation so that if this stuff doesn't stick, that other companies could do?
Yeah. So we have a bunch of different methods. When we roll out pie crust, what you can do is you can lay out like silicone mats and roll your pie crust between those mats. That's one option. When you are shaping like a cinnamon roll or something like that, you can just put some oil on the surface. Obviously a healthy oil such as, an avocado oil or a really nice olive oil or something like that. And also other times that you think that you need a floured or lubricated surface, you simply do not need one. When people are shaping bread, they think they need a floured surface. You don't. It actually helps to have it not floured because you can use the fact that it's sticking to that surface to shape it. You can kind of pull it and the surface itself will pull on the bread and shape it with you. So we just circumvent it using other things to lubricate it, but also using that sticking in our favor too.
All right. So we've got this double fermented time traveler bread. Mm-hmm. We've got a greater probability of, let me make sure I got all the benefits, right?
Yeah,
so we're using bacteria versus yeast to really as our starter. Mm-hmm. The bacteria is going to provide flavoring that the yeast may not provide. Mm-hmm. Because we've got the bacteria that's producing the acid, that's producing flavoring, we also mm-hmm. believe that extra acid and fermentation time is going to have a better ability to break down the proteins and peptides to potentially make it safer. Not just maybe the gliadin peptides that people typically react to, but maybe some of the other peptides. You don't use a typical flour that somebody might use in conventional sourdough bread to make it. And because of the way the bread is made and the carbs are essentially maybe even broken down a little bit more, you have less of a glycemic effect from this bread, maybe even more than a traditional sourdough bread, possibly. Okay.
Correct.
So all that sounds good. Now you said you tested this on people to check you checked their glucose spikes, right? And then you checked them for more of a symptomatic response, or was there conventional testing done to see if they had a difference or change?
Right. So concerning glucose, we could test those. That's a
glucose monitor, CMG, yeah.
And that holds. It's good. It's awesome. And then for other things, it was symptomatic testing. So for example, this person has PCOS. They consumed it and they have symptoms with any other bread that they have, but they have no symptoms with this bread. This person, myself, has fibromyalgia. They have issues with any other bread they eat, as well as honestly most carbohydrates in general. Okay, they don't experience issues symptomatically with this bread. And so we've been open, let me think here, when did we start doing farmers markets? Since 2017-ish about. And so we've now had hundreds and hundreds of people with basically every type of autoimmune issue come through our doors, and report to us that no, the symptoms are not coming. So they were symptomatic tests in short.
Okay. And I think it's important for the listener because they're saying, hey, important. This is awesome. Nathan says I can eat his bread. I was reactive to wheat. I can eat it. And what we're not saying that everybody that eats this may not have an immune or an inflammatory response to it, or a gluten type reaction. You could still have a response, a reaction for various reasons.
Correct.
And so symptomatically is sometimes looking at your symptoms is a great tool to say, hey, something there bothered me. Mm-hmm. But as we talked about almost right in the beginning, sometimes you can eat something and not have what most people would consume as a food reaction, which is a gut-based issue. Some people don't have any response for 2 or 3 days. Sometimes it takes up to 72 hours for an immune response to really kick in. And so if you decide to try something like this, 2 things to do. 1, watch your signs, watch your symptoms. The other thing might be to, if you have, not everybody has the feasibility to do it, but you might want to, after a period of time of being asymptomatic when you eat it, you might want to consider something like a Cyrex Array 2, which is a really good comprehensive gluten test, and say, hey, is there anything here that I'm triggering to? And it's tough because you could be getting exposure to other things, but if you did a pre-test and then you did a post-test and said, man, I've been eating the same diet for the last 60 days that I was eating the 60 days before. The only thing that's changed is I've introduced this time traveler bread.
Double heavy fermented bread.
And my numbers look fantastic. Then you could pretty much confirm that, hey, this is probably fine for you to eat. So that's that next level beyond just looking at signs and symptoms. Mm-hmm. So how do we refer? I think you said double heavy fermented bread. Is that the lingo?
Yeah, that's the lingo, but you can call it time travelers. I don't care either way.
So is your company the only company that's doing this now?
Yeah, we're the only company that practices double heavy fermentation. The only one. There are other companies that do advertise that they use real fermentation, that people often with gluten issues can handle their products, but they do not use the double heavy fermentation techniques. They may be applying flour later in the process, like I said, or it might be something where, we ferment it authentically, but as for the depth of fermentation that we're talking about, we're the only ones that do it.
So is double heavy fermentation a term that you guys coined, or is that a term that's been used prior and that's kind of a standard term?
It's not a standard term. It's something that we coined because this is something that, again, you cannot find anywhere else. You can't find anyone because we have searched for people that are actually leaving out the flour in that process. We have searched for people who are actually doing a long ferment in a warm environment. And so in order to actually tell people about it, we had to have a term to explain it to them. So yes, it is a term that describes our process specifically.
Yeah, and that's fine. But if somebody goes Googling for double heavy fermentation,
they're going to find our stuff. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. But then if you take a little bit further, just to explain more so, not just the name double heavy fermentation is no one doing, it's the techniques. Like there is literally no other bakery currently, and I hope that there will be someday, but there is not currently anyone else that's following these techniques. So not just the name double heavy fermentation, but there isn't anyone doing these techniques.
All right. So now people are maybe interested and they're like, man, I'm interested in this double heavy fermentation process. Mm-hmm. You have a storefront that's located where?
It's in Provo, Utah.
Okay. And so now they say, I want to try it. Where can they order a loaf of bread, or can they order like sourdough, double heavy fermented like rolls, or
Yeah.
And how they go about that? Because can they get it at a grocery store? Can they go walk into their Whole Foods and get it? Like, where do they get it?
Currently, you can purchase at our store. And then there's obviously like other local restaurants around the area that carry some of our products. But we also ship to most of the US. We ship our 3 classic breads to most of the US. And we have a little sample pack too that's just a couple of like 3 slices of bread that you can even ship to yourself if you just want to spend like $2 or $3 for shipping, just to try it. So they can ship products all that they want to themselves. Another thing too, though, is we do not want this process to be secret. And we also don't want it to be expensive, because it gets expensive to ship food to yourself. I think many of us are familiar with that with autoimmune issues. So what we did is we actually made a class package that teaches you how to make all of our breads, every single like one of our classic flavors, but it also teaches you the real like fermentation process and how to make even something called a fermented fry bread. That is the most heavily fermented product that you could produce. And they can produce that in their own home. They can make all the breads in their own home. It comes with a starter that gets shipped directly to their doorstep. So whatever's most cost effective for people, they can do. And one note on this, if they did take that class, they can order flour from us because we've vetted it. We've seen that it works. They can also buy, organic flour at a local grocer. We talk a little bit about flour and sourcing flour in that class package. So they could purchase flour at a local grocer and do a little bit of testing on their end, and that would probably be great.
All right.
They can purchase flour through us. Whatever they want to do will be a wonderful option.
So what are the 3 types of bread that you offer? So just so I get an idea.
Yeah, right. The 3 types of bread that we offer in shipping and in store are our classic sourdough, which is just flour, water, and salt, nothing else. Our honey wheat, which is flour, water, and salt, and then we add some honey and some extra virgin olive oil to that, and it tastes kind of like a mild Hawaiian sweet roll. And then our third bread is our dark bread, which is flour, water, and salt. And then we add some honey, molasses, and cocoa powder to that. And you'd think, oh, it's going to taste like chocolate. But no, the cocoa powder just gives it kind of a deep flavor. So it has kind of a sweet and deep flavor to it. And then we also offer some other products in shop too, than those just classic breads.
So different types of breads. They can go online, they can order the breads, and they can be delivered, right? What's the average cost of a loaf without shipping?
$7.50 for a 2-pound loaf.
So, when you think, I don't grocery store shop, but my wife does. And I think the common or the classic gluten-free loaf of bread is probably $8-9, right?
Correct. So gluten-free bread is approximately twice the price of ours, because you think, oh, but I buy my loaf. It's because some of them are $5. But those loaves are on average 1 pound. So let's say that a loaf is $5-6, something like that. So if their bread is about 1 pound or less, ours is just over 2 pounds for $7.50. So the price comparison is there for that.
So I can order the bread. The other thing I can do is, and we talked about this in the beginning, like if I want to do this and I can order my, we got to come up with a good name. The starter, right? Because we don't want to use yeast, right? So we've got our sourdough starter, right?
Right.
I can order that from you?
Yeah, so you can order our class package, which will teach you all of our methods, and it comes with a starter for free. You can also just order a starter, but just if you just want a starter and you're confident in your abilities to figure all this out, whatever is best for you. But the class package is going to show you everything, give you the recipes, blah, 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 everything along with the starter that comes with it.
But the key becomes, part of the next piece of that becomes the quality of the flour, though, too, right? Because we're talking about toxicity of stuff. So what are the tips that you give people? And maybe that's in your core class that you give, is how do I know I'm getting a good, clean flour to start with?
Right. So again, you can order flour through us because we vetted it. It's what we've tested with. However, it's not like we're the only people in the world that offer clean grains. So you can order through us, and it's a great option. But if you were to go to a local grocer and order an organic flour or something like that, organic is going to protect against those chemicals. It will definitely protect against those chemicals that we've talked about. And then you can bake with that and you should be in a good position. So there are a lot of different options. Some people even find that if they just bake with a basic flour, that they don't experience symptoms if they use this double heavy fermentation process. I always say, if you're going to make, the fermentation just breaks down a lot of that stuff.
Right.
I always say, though, if you're going to make a beautiful painting, why not start with high quality paint? So, you can kind of get there in a better way. But there are some people that find success in just using a basic flour. It's just going to be a little bit more of a risk doing it that way.
Yeah, and especially when we talked about, hey, the things that could be in the glyphosate that could be in there that disrupts your gut biome, right? And so if you have a higher quality wheat to start with, it doesn't have that in there. So can I take, I don't have one, but if I've got my bread machine at home, I can duplicate it with the starter, with the flour, and with some lessons, I can duplicate the bread in my bread machine, in my oven, or like I could do it at home. I could do it at home, right?
Yes, you can easily do it at home. And before I described it, I was like, oh yeah, I have to mix it before, and then it, goes overnight into the next day, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, I don't want to do that at home. So when I described that, here's what the process really is like. I'm mixing it the day before and just mixing it up and putting it in a bowl to ferment overnight. And then the next day I'm shaping it into a loaf and I'm putting it in the oven. It takes a long time for it to do its process. But how much hands-on time am I doing? Most of that long time is the fermentation is just doing its work. It's not that I am fully involved babysitting this thing. The hands-on time for this recipe is probably 20 minutes. It's not very long. So it's not like you're committing to a big deal to be making these things.
So I don't bake bread typically. Matter of fact, I don't bake bread. But if I was making bread at home, how long would I typically let that bread ferment? And how long would I be letting it with yours? How long am I letting it ferment? How long would a traditional loaf be fermented if I'm making it at home?
You're good. Yeah. So a traditional loaf with lab produced yeast would rise for approximately 3, sometimes 6 hours. Ours with the fermented base using the probiotics and acids and all that stuff, we are going to do a minimum of 15 hours.
So if I do it today, throw it in the fridge, a day later, I could be in the oven making my bread.
Yep. And you wouldn't even put it in the fridge. You just leave it on
your outside, right. We want to keep it out because it helps it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. A normal room temperature environment is the best. It's wonderful for it.
Doesn't need to be covered or really.
Yeah. So you just throw a towel over the top or saran wrap or whatever, but
you want air to get at it, right?
Yeah. You just want it to not be so airtight where the bread can't rise, but just any generic lid or towel thrown over the top is great.
Got it. All right. So I think we got it all. I haven't tried it, but now I'm curious to try it out. So if people want to know more about Time Traveler Bakery and maybe being able to make make bread at home, or be able to or order bread so they can actually have maybe less expensive, real tasting bread that's healthier for them, where can they go?
So they can just go to timetravelersbakery.com and it will guide them through the whole process. They can order the class there. They can order, a bread box there. It's just a box of, whatever breads you choose to put in there. They can order a little free sample baggie just to test it on themselves. So anything that they want to order to ship to themselves is just right there. They can order flour or whatever. Although we are currently in a grain shortage in America, so that is a rough situation right now. But yes.
We are?
Yes, America is in a grain shortage currently with the last season's growing season was we had very little rain across the US. So there was a grain shortage as a result of that. And then with the war that's happening in Ukraine, which is a very unfortunate situation, there's a lot of assistance going to them. And there's a lot of different factors where there is somewhat of a grain shortage happening right now. So anyways, that's a completely different subject, but just, if we are running low on flour or anything like that, then that's what's going on. We want to make sure we can bake stuff for you too. So
that's awesome. So great. I'll put the link to the website and your information in there. Any final thoughts or points do you want to make regarding this bread in general? What would any final points?
My final points would be that if you are experiencing anything and you feel like you are having to live a law-driven life, that everything is rule-based so that you can survive, that's not the only way to live. And obviously we always have to have rules in the way that we're living and eating and things for health. But oftentimes when we go back and consume things the old way, it seems like there's a little bit less rules and a little bit more of just lifestyle choices. And that's how Time Travelers came about, is we want it to be back in time, back in health, less about very specific rules all the time. Rules are very important and good, and scientific data is very important and very good, as we have talked about. But it's also really good just to do things sometimes the old way and not experience these modern issues and have to live by rules so much.
Yeah, I think that's important. And this isn't the only food that we've seen that the new ways, milk is a great example of that.
Yes.
That the new ways that make it quicker, faster, and we thought was better is actually probably not the better way to do things. And maybe there is some wisdom in the things that were done for hundreds of years before technology said, how do we do this faster, cheaper, and deal with the bottom line? And ultimately, the bottom line isn't the dollar. Ultimately, the bottom line is your health, well-being, quality of life, and that's why something like this may improve health and quality of life for you. So, Nathan, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. It's an eye-opener. It's something that's may make a lot of people happy if they can try a product that's closer to what they remember as a child, what bread was before they had this restrictive diet. So maybe this can fill the gap. So I appreciate you coming on, and I look forward to checking this out and see how good it is. All right. So thanks for coming on the podcast. Okay.
Oh, yes. Have a lovely day. Bye.
Bye-bye.